Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really important issue, anxiety in childhood. You've shared a fascinating piece of research with us, a 1991 paper from the Educational Psychology Review titled The Nature and Treatment of Childhood Anxiety by Wendy K. Silverman and Christopher A. Kearney.
Yes, it's a great source. It really gives us a lens, a look back at how we thought about and addressed anxiety in younger people around that time.
Exactly. And, while we often hear a lot about outward behaviors in children, things like acting out or being hyperactive,
hmm
these inward struggles like anxiety, they can be just as significant, right, in
Sure.
their impact on a child's life.
Absolutely. This paper, from the early 90s, it offers a truly insightful snapshot of where the field stood then, understanding and treating these internalizing challenges.
Okay, let's unpack this. It seems like this paper really focuses on three main areas. First, how childhood anxiety was classified back then.
Right.
Second, how it was assessed. And third, what kinds of treatment strategies were being used. It's almost like a historical blueprint.
Precisely. And as we explore these areas, you'll notice a recurring theme. Despite the considerable progress made by the early 90s, understanding and treating childhood anxiety was, and in many ways still is, a complex and evolving landscape.
Yeah.
There were already lively discussions happening, and a clear need for more personalized, more effective ways to help kids experiencing anxiety was definitely becoming apparent.
So let's dive into classification. This feels like the most fundamental step.
Mm.
How do you even define what you're talking about?
hmm
The paper points out that the DSM system, specifically the DSM-IR at that time, was the dominant force in the U.S. for classifying these kinds of difficulties.
Mm.
Now, for our listeners who might not be familiar, the DSM-IR was the third revised edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders.
Yes, the standard system for classifying mental health conditions in the U.S. back then. And it provided a categorical system for diagnosing mental disorders, including those related to anxiety in children. However, even in 1991, the authors highlight some pretty significant criticisms of this categorical approach.
Right, things like the potential for negative effects simply from labeling a child, which, intuitively makes sense.
Yeah.
But also, the paper mentions that the DSM wasn't necessarily helping us understand which treatments would actually be most effective. That's a crucial point, isn't it?
It really is. Just giving a child a diagnostic label doesn't automatically tell you how to help them.
So what you're telling me is that back then, even with a seemingly clear diagnostic system, clinicians were facing real challenges in understanding the nuances of a child's anxiety and knowing how to best support them.
Exactly. The paper also touches on the DSM's limitations in considering how anxiety might present differently at various stages of childhood development.
Developmental factors.
hmm Plus, there were even questions being raised about the fundamental reliability and validity of some of the diagnostic categories themselves. The authors mention work by Achenbach, Burke, and Silverman, important figures.
It's interesting how they then shift to this idea of a syndrome. It's not just about isolated symptoms, but rather as like a cluster of them that tend to occur together.
That's a very insightful way to put it. The concept of a syndrome, as the paper explains, it draws on ideas from behavioral research like response class and response covariation. Essentially, certain anxiety symptoms tend to appear together,
Okay.
and changes in one can often be linked to changes in others. This idea of interconnectedness among anxiety symptoms is a key aspect of understanding these syndromes.
And then the paper delves into the specific childhood anxiety disorder syndromes recognized in the DSM-IIR. We're talking about separation anxiety disorder,
Mm.
SAD,
Right.
avoidant disorder, or AVD, and overanxious disorder, OAD. Let's take them one by one. Separation anxiety disorder, SAD, sounds like it's more than just the child being a little clingy when starting school.
Oh, definitely. SAD, as it was defined then, involved excessive anxiety specifically related to being separated or even just thinking about being separated from major attachment figures or their home.
Okay.
The symptoms they list include intense worry about harm coming to themselves or their loved ones, actively avoiding being alone, and even physical complaints like stomach aches when separation is anticipated.
So it's not just being sad when mom or dad leaves for work.
No, no. It's an intense, almost panicked reaction, sometimes with kids refusing to even sleep in their own beds.
Wow. Then there's avoidant disorder, AVD. This one sounds more like a general social withdrawal, particularly from other children or adults they aren't familiar with.
Precisely. The core feature of AVD was described as a persistent and excessive withdrawal from social contact with older children or adults. This included actively avoiding strangers and significant difficulty in forming and maintaining peer relationships. The focus here was more on social avoidance outside the immediate family.
Got it. And finally, overanxious disorder, OAD. This one feels a bit broader, like a more generalized worry that isn't tied to one specific situation.
That's a good way to characterize it. OAD was defined by excessive worry and fearful behavior that wasn't focused on a single situation or object.
Right.
Children with OAD might worry excessively about their competence, like their schoolwork. They could experience physical symptoms, find it hard to relax, and often showed excessive self-consciousness.
It's interesting that they also point out that adult anxiety disorder diagnoses could be used for children if they met the criteria. That seems like it could be a bit tricky. Are adult anxieties always going to manifest in the same way in a child?
That's exactly the kind of question the authors raised. They emphasized that in 1991, research specifically on these well-defined childhood anxiety disorders was really just, well, in its initial stages. Things like how common they were, how they tended to progress over time, what caused them, and what the long-term outlook was, were largely unknown. And the appropriateness of simply applying adult diagnostic criteria to children hadn't been thoroughly investigated.
The paper also touches on other anxiety-related problems that didn't neatly fit into those DSM-5 categories.
Yeah.
School phobia is one that jumps out,
Ah, yes.
though they immediately clarify that our understanding of that has evolved into school refusal behavior.
Yes, that's a really crucial distinction. The traditional term school phobia suggested a single specific fear of school itself.
Right.
But as research demonstrated, children who refused to go to school were actually a very diverse group. Their refusal could stem from a whole range of underlying anxiety issues. SAID, AVD, OAD, even specific phobias like social phobia.
So for you, the listener, this is a crucial shift. Instead of just seeing school phobia as one problem,
Exactly. The focus became understanding your child's specific reasons. Are they avoiding something at school or seeking something at home? That difference fundamentally changes how you'd approach it.
so it wasn't just one thing. It could be about the fear of being separated from parents, or fear of social interactions at school, or general worries that just made the school environment feel overwhelming. That makes so much sense. The paper really emphasizes the critical need to understand the reason behind the school refusal.
Absolutely. And the treatment then needs to be carefully tailored to that underlying reason, rather than just treating school phobia as if it were a single, uniform problem.
Another interesting point is test anxiety. It's such a common experience, but it wasn't formally classified as a distinct disorder either.
Right.
And the paper brings up data showing that a significant percentage of children experiencing test anxiety also met the diagnostic criteria for other anxiety disorders like OAD, social phobia, or SAD. This really underscores the idea that these anxieties often don't occur in isolation.
Exactly. For many children, test anxiety appears to be less of a standalone issue and more of a symptom or a specific manifestation of a broader underlying anxiety state.
Let's move on to how reliable and valid this DSM classification was at the time. The paper discusses the efforts to increase reliability through the use of structured interviews. What were those all about?
Well, structured interviews were developed to make the diagnostic process more objective and consistent. Instead of a clinician relying solely on a free-flowing conversation, these interviews use specific sets of questions and standardized criteria to systematically assess symptoms.
Okay.
The main goal was to increase the level of agreement, the reliability between different clinicians interviewing the same child. DiNardo and his colleagues did pioneering work here.
But the paper also points out that the initial studies using these structured interviews didn't always lead to the most reliable diagnoses, citing a study using the KSA-DSP
Kitty says yes.
that found a pretty low reliability score for the general category of anxiety disorder. This is a bit concerning if the main goal was consistency.
It is indeed. While later studies did show somewhat more encouraging results, the paper mentions Ambrosini, Hodges, Silverman, and Nels, the findings were still somewhat mixed. Methodological factors in how these reliability studies were conducted might have played a role, but it definitely highlighted that achieving consistent anxiety disorder diagnoses in children wasn't as straightforward as hoped.
Okay, so consistency was an issue. Then the focus shifts to validity, and particularly discriminant validity. How well can we actually distinguish between these different anxiety disorders?
Right. That's the next big question.
The paper starts by looking at demographic differences. For example, age seemed to be a factor, with simple phobias related to school tending to appear in older children, OAD in the mid-range, and SED in younger children, based on research by Last and colleagues.
Yes, these demographic trends offered some initial support for the idea that these might be distinct disorders. The typical age of onset seemed to vary somewhat.
And gender differences, too, with SAD being reportedly more prevalent in males in some studies by last, while simple phobia seemed equally common in boys and girls before puberty. Interestingly, they didn't find major gender differences in school refusal in the work of Kearney and his team.
That finding really underscores how school refusal can be a behavioral manifestation of different underlying anxiety issues,
Yep.
which themselves might have varying rates in boys and girls.
Socioeconomic status also seemed to show some connections, with SAD linked to lower SES, OAD to middle SES, and simple phobia of school to higher SES, again, according to last's research.
Yeah, these correlations are intriguing. They make you wonder about potential environmental or familial factors that might be at play.
Absolutely. Well, these are just correlations. Obviously, they don't tell us about cause and effect.
Right.
But they do suggest that different types of anxiety disorders might be linked to different broader social and economic contexts. The paper then looks at whether psychological measures could help differentiate these disorders. The Fear Survey Schedule for Children Revised, or FSSCR, seemed to show some promise
Yeah.
in identifying patterns of intense fears that were more common in different anxiety disorders, like social evaluative fears in OAD, or fears of getting lost in SA, according to Last, Francis, and Strauss.
That sounds like it could be really valuable for clinicians.
It does. The idea that the specific pattern of a child's fears, not just the overall number, might be a key distinguishing factor and could even help guide treatment selection, that was a significant development.
But it sounds like a lot of other self-report measures weren't as helpful in distinguishing between the different anxiety disorders, as noted in research by Last and Silverman. However, the worry and oversensitivity factor on the Children's Manifest Anxiety Scale Revised, this CMASR, did show some potential in differentiating DSM-free anxiety disorders from other psychological difficulties based on Madison's research. And Madison and Bagnato found a correlation between an OAD diagnosis in boys and certain profiles on the Child Behavior Checklist and that CMASR worry factor. But they also caution, more research is needed across ages and genders.
So some encouraging signs, but nothing conclusive yet.
That's a fair assessment. The field was actively searching for reliable and valid ways to differentiate these disorders using questionnaires and scales, but further research was clearly needed.
Finally, in terms of validity, the paper discusses comorbidity. How often do these different anxiety disorders overlap?
Yes, the overlap.
It sounds like there are some common pairings, like SAD frequently occurring with OAD, and OAD often co-occurring with avoidant disorder or social phobia, again from last research. However, simple phobia of school seemed to appear alongside a wider, less predictable range of other diagnoses.
These patterns of comorbidity raise important questions, right? Are these truly distinct disorders, or perhaps different manifestations of underlying vulnerabilities? As Silverman points out, understanding whether these additional co-occurring diagnoses actually enhance the validity of the system and help identify truly distinctive subgroups was a key area for future investigation.
So summarizing the classification challenges, it sounds like while the DSM-IRR was the standard, it definitely faced its share of criticism, reliability, validity concerns.
Right, and that categorical approach felt too rigid, too dichotomous, didn't always capture the complexities clinicians were seeing.
Exactly. The paper highlights this growing frustration with a system that could feel too inflexible, maybe too trait-oriented, lacking symptom quantification, and sometimes just not feeling like it accurately reflected the reality. Poor face validity, as they call it.
And this dissatisfaction led to a growing interest in exploring alternative ways of understanding anxiety.
And the paper mentions this emerging shift towards more developmental, dimensional, and functional ways of thinking. Could you elaborate briefly on those?
Certainly. A developmental approach stresses understanding anxiety in the context of the child's age and developmental stage.
Makes sense.
A dimensional approach views symptoms on a continuum, mild to severe, rather than in neat categories, more nuanced.
Okay.
And a functional approach focuses on the purpose or function of the anxious behaviors. What are they helping the child avoid or gain?
That functional approach seems particularly interesting, connecting back to the school refusal discussion, understanding the reasons why.
Precisely. And later in the paper, the authors present a functional model specifically for school refusal behavior as a prime example of this important shift.
Okay, before we get there, let's talk about behavioral assessment. How was anxiety actually being measured back then? The paper notes a lot of research focused on specific situations like nighttime fears or test anxiety, rather than the broader DSM diagnoses.
That's true. While the DSM provided the classification framework, much of the assessment research zeroed in on more specific fear responses, often easier to observe and study in controlled settings. Though the authors do mention some exceptions where researchers were starting to link behavioral assessments to the formal DSM disorders.
The paper really emphasizes this multi-component view of anxiety, cognitive subjective thoughts, feelings, behavioral actions, avoidance, and physiological, heart rate, sweating.
Yes, and crucially that these components aren't always highly correlated. They don't always sync up perfectly.
Right. A child might report intense fear but not show much avoidance, or vice versa.
Exactly. Which highlights the need to assess all three components to get a comprehensive picture.
So let's break down the assessment for each. For cognitive subjective, clinical interviews were key for understanding thoughts and feelings. And structured interviews like the DSC and A-to-C were developed for kids.
Yes, these aimed to systematically gather that internal experience info. While the paper reiterates Silverman's point about reliability evidence being insufficient in research settings at that point due to study limitations, they were still seen as clinically valuable tools for getting info directly from the child and parents.
Then there were self-report measures, like the FSSCR, CMASR, STAY-SA questionnaires.
Right.
But the paper notes concerns about their construct validity. Were they really measuring specific anxiety or maybe a broader negative affectivity?
That's a really important limitation. Easy to administer, yes, but you have to question what they're truly measuring, specific anxiety, or just a general tendency to report negative feelings.
The fear thermometer sounds like a simpler approach, maybe using colors or numbers. Seemed consistent and correlated with the FSSCR. More child-friendly, perhaps.
It is. Visual analog scales like that can be particularly useful for younger kids who might struggle with complex questionnaires.
Self-monitoring, where kids track their own avoidance, fear, thoughts. That's interesting. The paper says kids can be pretty accurate. But there wasn't much psychometric research on it back then. Seems valuable for real-time insights, though.
Absolutely. It provides rich, context-specific data. But yeah, establishing its formal reliability and validity through rigorous research is crucial for broader use.
And finally, for cognitive, think aloud procedures, kids verbalizing thoughts during exposure, but used less often due to complexity in coding the thoughts and lingering reliability validity questions.
Yes, potentially very insightful into cognitive processes, but they require significant methodological rigor, which likely limited their widespread use at the time.
Okay, shifting to behavioral assessment. Naturalistic observation, watching kids in real-world settings like classrooms. Rating scales were developed for things like dental fear or separation distress.
Yeah.
Advantage.
Yeah.
Ecological validity.
Right. Seeing behavior in its natural context.
But disadvantages,
Yeah.
work intensive, and the behavior might not even happen while you're watching. Now, for our listeners, ecological validity, that just means how well the observed behavior reflects real life, right?
Exactly. It's about real-world relevance. But naturalistic observation has those practical trade-offs, time, resources, maybe missing the behavior entirely.
Analog observation, like the behavioral avoidance test, BAT, sounds easier. Observing a child approach something feared in a controlled setting. But the paper notes a lack of standardized procedures for kids back then and limited reliability validity data. Still, they say it had clinical utility.
Yeah, that happens. Sometimes the direct information, even if not rigorously quantified, provides clinical insights that inform treatment for that individual. But standardization and more psychometric data would definitely strengthen such methods.
Lastly, physiological assessment. Heart rate monitoring used more with adults, less with kids except for temporary fears. Clinical utility for diagnosed disorders in kids was still unclear.
Right.
Heart rate and sweat gland activity, Palmer sweat index, were mentioned as potential indicators. But even the sweat index could be influenced by other factors.
Physiological measures hold promise, sure, for an objective index, but practical challenges with kids in clinical settings, plus the need for much more research on reliability, validity, and interpretation in this population, were big considerations then.
So, overall assessment summary. Lots of strategies, but linked back to classification issues. The three response systems weren't super well defined for kids. Discriminant validity needed evaluation. And maybe the biggest flaw was poor clinical utility in predicting treatment success. Plus, overlap with depression symptoms, lack of standardization, poor link to treatment strategies, paints a picture of a field developing, but with hurdles.
That's a very accurate summary. The field was evolving fast, but there was a strong recognition of the need for more refined tools and a clearer understanding of how assessment could directly inform and predict treatment outcomes.
Okay, let's move on to the behavioral treatments being used. The paper lists several: contingency management, systematic desensitization, implosive flooding, modeling, and cognitive self-control strategies. Quite a toolkit.
It is indeed. And the paper details each, often of examples from clinical research at the time.
Contingency management sounds like it's all about the relationship between behavior and consequences, modifying consequences, especially for avoidance, using rewards for exposure, limiting attention for avoidance, used a lot for school refusal and separation anxiety. Now, for our listeners, operant conditioning here basically means
Learning through consequences. Rewards make behaviors more likely. Lack of reward or punishment makes them less likely. So contingency management strategically uses rewards and consequences to encourage brave behaviors and discourage avoidance. The examples in the paper show how this helped kids overcome separation anxiety and school refusal by shaping behavior through reinforcement.
and systematic desensitization. Volpe's idea reduced fear by teaching incompatible behaviors like relaxation, create an anxiety hierarchy, pair relaxation with each step, gradually counter the anxiety. The paper mentions Mary Cover-Jones's early work.
Yes, a foundational study. She worked with a boy afraid of rabbits, paired the rabbit's gradual introduction with pleasant eating. Fear diminished as the rabbit became associated with a positive experience. Early counterconditioning.
Ah.
Systematic desensitization became very common for child anxiety then, though the paper notes its effectiveness hadn't been rigorously examined in many well-controlled studies with kids.
So you teach relaxation, make the anxiety ladder, work your way up while staying relaxed.
Right.
Examples given range from test anxiety to needle phobias, even self-directed desensitization for noise phobias.
Exactly. The paper shows its versatility across different anxieties, often with positive outcomes reported in case studies.
Implosion and flooding sound more intense. Immediate, prolonged exposure to the most feared thing. Implosive therapy has a psychodynamic framework. What does that mean here?
It means its roots are in psychodynamic theory, emphasizing unconscious conflicts. Implosive therapy aims to extinguish anxiety by having the person vividly imagine feared scenarios, often with psychodynamic themes, without negative reinforcement. Exposure and imagination decreases anxiety tied to unconscious conflicts.
I see. And flooding.
Flooding is typically direct exposure to the actual feared object or situation, real life or vivid imagery, potential for rapid results, but also risk of incomplete extinction or sensitization making anxiety worse, like Rockman's spider phobia example, seemed explored for things like PTSD in kids.
Modeling seems straightforward. Kids learn by observing others handle feared situations successfully. Live person or symbolic, like a video. The dog phobia studies are classic. And using videos preventively for kids facing surgery, clever.
Yes, modeling leverages observational learning. Seeing someone cope confidently reduces the child's fear and encourages them to try. Bandura's and Melamed's work highlights its effectiveness.
Finally, self-control procedures, or cognitive therapy, becoming more widely used then, helping kids identify negative thoughts, develop positive self-statements, apply them. Used for fear of the dark, test anxiety, school refusal.
Self-control procedures empower kids to manage their own anxiety by challenging negative thoughts and replacing them with coping thoughts. Studies by Confer, Nelson, and Kearney and Silverman illustrate how teaching cognitive restructuring and stress inoculation could reduce anxiety and avoidance across various problems.
The paper then gives a really important critical summary of this treatment research. It points out many evaluations were case studies, lacking rigorous controls.
Right.
Modeling and self-control had more studies with better experimental designs. They call for stricter evaluations of contingency management and systematic desensitization.
That's crucial for the field. Case studies offer insights but don't prove effectiveness or allow comparisons. The call for more controlled research was vital for evidence-based practice.
Another big issue. Many studies combine procedures, making it hard to know what specifically worked. And Lehrer and Woolfolk's points about lacking research on incremental validity and component comparisons were still relevant.
Yes, the field needed to move beyond if it worked to why it worked and which elements were most effective. That detail is essential for refining treatments.
Also, concerns about inconsistent outcome criteria. Variable measures, often relying just on parent reports. Methodological inconsistencies impacting validity.
Absolutely. Without standardized outcomes and multifaceted data, comparing studies and drawing firm conclusions is really challenging.
And perhaps most importantly, Almost no studies identified which factors, child characteristics, or treatment aspects contributed to success or failure, limiting clinical utility for diverse individuals. The big takeaway: need to better integrate assessment with treatment selection.
Precisely the core issue, understanding which treatments work best for which kids with specific anxieties, based on thorough assessment of their needs and maintaining factors. That was clearly the crucial direction forward.
This leads perfectly into the functional model for school refusal. Emphasizes it's not one thing, needs tailored treatment based on the reason for refusal. Avoiding negative experiences at school, negative reinforcement, or seeking rewards at home, positive reinforcement, are key maintaining factors.
Yes, this functional model from Kearney and Silverman was a significant step towards a more individualized approach. Recognizing different underlying reasons means the intervention needs to target those specific factors.
And the School Refusal Assessment Scale, SRAS, was developed to evaluate these maintaining variables. Looked at 4 main reasons: avoiding fear over anxiousness, escaping aversive social situations, seeking attention separation anxiety, or seeking tangible rewards at home, like truancy.
The SRAS aimed for an objective, empirical way to understand the function of the refusal. Identifying the primary reason helps clinicians develop targeted treatment plans.
The paper mentions promising initial reliability and validity for the SRAS and preliminary evidence for treatment utility. A small study showed individualized treatment based on SRAs led to most kids returning to school with less distress, maintained at follow-up. They acknowledged the lack of a control group, sure, but it still seemed like a really innovative approach, linking assessment directly to targeted intervention for school refusal.
Exactly. It served as a compelling early example of how understanding the maintaining factors through systematic assessment could lead to more effective, tailored treatments. The authors explicitly called for similar functional models for other childhood anxiety issues, too.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into this insightful 1991 paper, the key message for you, our listeners, seems to be that childhood anxiety, while we've made huge strides since then, remains complex. Even back then, there were active debates about classification and assessment and a clear recognition of the need for more individualized intervention strategies.
Yes, and this paper really underscores that important shift towards functional approaches, understanding the why behind the anxiety, not just the label. That perspective was gaining traction then and remains hugely influential today.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Consider how understanding the specific function of anxious behaviors, rather than just the label, could offer new perspectives on support, not just in childhood, but across the lifespan.
Absolutely.
We definitely encourage you to explore the research mentioned and keep following the evolving work in this critical area. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.